The rains had come early that spring, softening the prairie into a wide, breathing skin. Willow sap bled through the seams of bark, and every night the frogs sang a little louder than the last. It was the season of return, of geese threading high across the sky, of snowmelt sinking deep into the black root beds. But for Ruth Ellen Stokes, the thaw brought no welcome. They'd turned her out in the middle of planting. No warning, no clemency. Her brother-in-law's voice, tight with God, bruised with fear, had carried over the scrubby pasture as he threw her satchel at her feet. This ain't your home anymore. Sarah's dead, and your debts are your own. She stood there a long while with wind twisting in her skirts, and nothing in her hands but a cracked water gourd and a seed pouch still half full. Her husband, Samuel, had been buried 3 winters past beneath a crooked cross of birch. Her sister Sarah, swallowed by fever before the frost broke, and now the homestead they'd wrested from stone and sweat had turned its back on her, just as the Lord seemed to have. Ruth had known hunger before, but not this kind of exile, the kind that steals your name from the land you stitched it to. The fields would still bloom, but not for her, not anymore. She walked east at first, following the low swells of the Yellowstone country, where the cottonwoods bent like tired saints and the air always smelled faintly of ash. She stayed to the margins, skirting ranch hands, stage roots, the stink of law. Once she bartered 2 skeins of thread for a strip of smoked venison from a mateys trapper. Another time she nearly shot a boy who crept too close to her fire, thinking him a coyote. By the time the snow returned in faint gusts, she was leaner, harder, not healed, just weathered into something that could survive. It was late dusk when she saw the smoke. A thin trail, no more than a whisper against the darkening ridgeline. She paused, watching, ears keen for horses or rifles, but there was only the cry of a redtail overhead and the sigh of pine. She crept nearer. The tent was low and worn, the hides stitched with care but patched many times over. A fire hissed in a ring of stones, and beside it sat a man. He did not move when she stepped into the firelight. He only looked up, slow and watchful, his face half-shadowed beneath a fur-lined hood. Crow. She knew it by the beadwork at his collar and the white markings stitched into his sleeves. His eyes did not narrow, did not judge. He studied her as if she were weather, something to be endured or respected, but not challenged. "I don't mean to trespass," she said. Still he said nothing. The fire cracked. "I only wanted warmth for the night. I won't steal, I won't stay." He gestured once, not unkindly, toward the ground opposite him. His voice, when it came, was gravel-soft. "You're already here." She sat. They shared the silence for a long while, until the chill settled deeper and the dark filled the spaces between the trees. He passed her a piece of hard bread and a sliver of dried meat. She chewed slowly, grateful. They spoke nothing more that night. At dawn, she meant to leave, but her boots were wet and her hip ached where she'd fallen on ice days before. The man was gone, but the fire had been stirred fresh and water left warming in a tin cup. She stayed another day, and another. By the 4th morning he spoke again. This time his gaze did not drift when he looked at her. "You carry grief like a wolf pelt." She didn't flinch, didn't ask what he meant. Instead, she nodded. "So do you." The corners of his mouth turned, not quite a smile. "My name is Ruth," she said, "Ruth Stokes." He offered no name in return. That night she lay beneath the edge of his tent flap, watching the fire throw shadows across the canvas, listening to the wind comb the branches above them. The man's breathing was even, grounded, but something in him, she knew, was not at rest. The scars on his forearms were not from labor, and the way he never let the fire die completely spoke of years where sleep came hard and safety was earned, not given. She did not ask, and he did not tell. But when morning came again, he left her a blanket rolled tight beside her own. And for the first time since she'd been cast out, she did not dream of falling. The thaw moved higher into the hills. Rivers, once thin as threads, thickened into ropes and pulled at their banks with hunger. Trees pushed out buds swollen with color, and the air took on that early green scent of lichen and moss waking up. Ruth gathered firewood, dry needles crackling in her apron, and learned where the man hung strips of meat beneath a cedar ridge, safe from wolves and worse. He still hadn't told her his name. She didn't press. Names were earned, not asked for, not in the kind of silence they shared, one shaped by survival more than courtesy. Most days he was gone before the sun, always returning with something slung over his back, a brace of grouse, a pelt, once a rusted horseshoe looped in cord. He moved with precision, the way deer do before a storm, quiet but not timid. Ruth watched the way he handled a blade, how he cleaned game with a care that bordered on reverence. He carried a war club tucked into the leather of his belt, worn smooth from years of use. But she never saw him reach for it. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was often with his hands. A gesture toward a ravine meant not to step there. A flat palm to the wind meant stop. It took her days to read these things, but once she did, she found a rhythm in his ways, like learning the grain of wood before you carve. It was she who asked the first true question. They were cleaning fish by the river, sun slanting hot against their backs, blood trailing in soft ribbons downstream. You fought. His fingers paused on the gill. The knife glinted, then stilled. He didn't look up, many times. She waited. I was a scout, he said finally, for the soldiers, but I never wore their coat. Why'd you stop? He rinsed the fish, letting the guts slip free. The silence that followed was long, but not empty. When you walk too long in death, he said, it walks with you. She didn't ask more, but that night, as the fire curled into blue, he placed an object in her hands. A pendant, carved of bone, shaped like a bird mid-flight. A raven, she asked, crow. His voice was quiet, not a correction, a truth. She ran her thumb along the curve of the wing. It was old, worn smooth at the edges. She knew what it meant when someone handed you something like that. It wasn't just a trinket. He let her hold it for a moment, then took it back, tucking it near his heart. My brother carved it before he died. We hunted together. You lost him in war. No, he said, and this time his voice was colder. We lost him after, in the peace. She understood that, though he said no more. There were many ways to be taken. Not all came with blood. Summer pressed down like a sleeping animal, hot and heavy, the air thick with the buzz of horseflies and pine resin. Ruth's hands grew strong with the work, scraping hides, binding kindling, tending snares. The lines of her face deepened in the sun, but so too did her calm. She'd long since stopped thinking about the homestead. Its betrayal had become a stone in her, solid and distant. What mattered now was the man who left water for her without asking, who never spoke behind her back because he never spoke without need. His name, when it finally came, arrived by accident. She'd burned her arm on a kettle iron, hissing through her teeth as she staggered back. He was on her in an instant, his hands sure as medicine. Atsa, she breathed as he tore a strip of cloth to wrap her. You always move like that. He stilled. You heard someone call me that. I heard you mutter it once in sleep. He pressed the bandage firm. It was my brother's name, too. The fire popped. Does it mean something? He nodded, reluctant. Crow for eagle, a name meant for watching. And you kept it. He looked away. I had to. That night he sat closer to her than he ever had. Still silent, but near enough she could hear the wind comb through the fringe of his jacket. She didn't ask anything more, not about the brother, not about what he had done in the years after the fighting. She had her own ghosts to keep. But later, when the coyotes cried too close and she flinched, he touched her arm just once. You're safe here, he said, and for the first time since she was turned out like a dog, she believed it. The highland winds came sharp and sudden in late summer, rattling the cottonwood leaves like bones. They snapped tents and stirred the ash in cold hearths. Some mornings Ruth woke to frost slicking the grass silver, the breath of the earth turning brittle too soon. The land was changing, tightening, preparing. So was she. She no longer thought of leaving. The question of how long had faded into the rhythm of days shaped by firewood and flint, arrow repairs, berry drying, and boots mended tight against chill. She rose before the light with Atsa, boiled what roots they had, and once caught a glimpse of herself in a still creek, her face harder, her eyes steadier, like they'd grown roots themselves. Atsa was teaching her without saying so. He never declared it, but in the way he paused to let her walk ahead when tracking, in the way he handed her a bow one morning without comment, then waited silently to see how she held it. She wasn't good, not at first, but he didn't correct her, just watched. Let her find the mistake in her own hands, They rarely spoke in the woods. It wasn't needed. There was a shared breath in tracking, how one bent low at a bent reed, how the other lifted a branch to read the bark beneath. They moved as two parts of one shape, each gesture understood. One evening they returned to camp with a fresh kill, a small deer, clean shot through the neck, and found the tent disturbed. Nothing stolen, but something had been shifted. Ruth's blanket turned. Atz's tools nudged out of place, signs subtle enough only a wary man would notice. He crouched low and stared long into the brush. The birds were quiet. He didn't speak until they'd cleaned the deer and hung it under cover. Someone passed through, watched. "You think they'll come back?" "They didn't take anything," he said, "which means they wanted to see. Not steal." She remembered then the old warning from her father, back when he was sober enough to teach. Those who don't take when they can, come back for what matters more. Ruth slept with her knife that night, its grip tucked against her spine. The next morning Atza led her farther into the ridge, to a place overgrown with fireweed and stone. There, beneath a shale outcrop, lay a second shelter, older, half sunken into the earth, but dry and tight. "I built this a long time ago," he said, "before the scouts, when I was still trying to disappear." He let her set the stones for the new fire, watched her build the windbreak. There was a quiet in him then, not the guarded silence she'd come to know, but something deeper, resigned, as if he were preparing not just for cold, but for reckoning. Later, while the fire smoked low and rabbits turned on the spit, Ruth asked the thing that had been stirring in her since that unsettled camp. "Did you leave something behind?" He didn't answer at once. Instead, he rose and stepped into the dusk, letting the wind wrap around him like old cloth. Only when the stars began their slow, silver climb did he speak. "My mother's people called this place sacred. Not for the spirits that lived here, but for the ones who couldn't leave. Soldiers buried near the river, my own kin scattered by the rail lines. I stayed to guard what was lost, but I think maybe I stayed too long." Ruth watched him carefully. "You think someone coming for you?" He looked over his shoulder, eyes tired. "No, I think they're coming for what I never buried." A week passed without sign, then a horse's scream tore through the valley. Ruth and Atza reached the ridge in moments, bows in hand. Below, in the clearing where they once camped, a man lay twisted beside a lame gelding. Blood soaked his leg. Two others crouched near, one rifling the saddlebag, the other dragging something from under the horse's flank. Atza narrowed his gaze. Ruth could see the edge of restraint in his jaw, the long breath he took before stepping forward. When he did, it was like watching a storm roll in. No words, just presence. He walked straight into the clearing, bow loose but ready. The men froze. One of them, pale, broad-shouldered, a starched kerchief at his throat, straightened and spat. Didn't mean to trespass. The horse spooked. Atza didn't flinch. Didn't look at the blood or the wreck of saddle. "This land isn't a road." The man squinted. "You the crow fella they talked about in Billings, the one used to track for the bluecoats." Silence. Ruth stepped beside Atza, her knife sheathed but visible. The man laughed. It wasn't friendly. "Didn't think you took in strays," he said, nodding toward her. "Must be your softening." Ruth's heart hammered. Atza didn't move, just stared until the man shifted his weight, suddenly unsure. "We'll move on," the stranger said, voice brittle. "Just need the horse righted." Atza gestured once slow. "Take your wounded, leave the rest." The man opened his mouth, but something in Atza's stillness made him think better. They limped off before dusk fell. When they were gone, Ruth turned. Who were they? "Doesn't matter," Atza said. "They're dust chasers, bounty men or worse, they follow stories." She knelt beside the saddlebag, checking the scattered things. "Atza," she said after a moment, holding up a folded, yellowed paper. "This have to do with you." He took it, scanned it, a bounty notice. Old, faded, a name she didn't recognize, but the face, it might have been his once. Atza burned it in the fire without a word. That night he slept with the war club beside him, and Ruth, instead of asking more, built the fire high and took first watch. The first snow came quiet, no warning, no cry of birds. Just a hush, a stilling of the wind. Then the sky fell in soft, white sheets that blurred the tree line and wrapped the hills in silence. Ruth woke to it pressing against the tent flaps, her breath a pale plume in the morning dim. By now she and Atsa shared the tent as matter of fact. The forest had closed in, and the world beyond their ridge was no place for solitude. They slept at opposite ends, but the fire between them burned steady. Warmth was no longer barter. It was bond. She spent those early winter weeks learning to trap under snow, to mend furs with sinew, to walk without leaving sign. Atsa taught her the names of tracks, how elk moved different from mule deer, how to listen for the low click of trees splitting in deep cold. He showed her how to store fat in hollowed bark, how to keep tinder dry even in sleet. She had never been taught these things. She learned them now with a hunger sharper than the wind. In return, she gave him stillness. He didn't say it. He never would, but Ruth saw it in the way he stopped pacing after dark, in how his hand no longer twitched toward the war club when coyotes called. She spoke when needed, not more. Let him keep his quiet. Let him know she was there without asking why he stayed. She could feel it now, the thing he carried, a weight in the bones, the kind that doesn't speak but marks you. She saw it when he stared too long into flame. When he woke some nights with his breath caught in his throat, no cry, just a grip on nothing. He had ghosts, not metaphor, not fancy, real ones, and they visited still. They found the woman in early December. Atsa caught the smell first, smoke, faint and wrong, not wood smoke, not cooked meat, fabric scorched. They followed it down a side ravine where the snow melted too fast and the stones stayed warm. She was curled beside a dead horse, wrapped in a coat too small for her shoulders, boots half-laced. Her face was blistered from sun, lips cracked and bleeding, one arm bent at a wrong angle. Ruth knelt first, felt the slow breath in the woman's throat. Atsa stood above them both, scanning the trail behind. They carried her back between them. She didn't wake for 2 days. When she did, it was with a sound like a knife pulled slow through canvas. Her eyes darted. She tried to sit. Ruth pressed her down, gentle but firm. "Easy," she said. "You're safe." The woman shook her head, lips barely moving. "No such thing." She told them her name was Josephine, said it like a curse. They didn't ask more, not then. Josephine stayed. She had nowhere else. Her arm healed poorly, stiff at the elbow, but she could sit by the fire and mend. She could fetch snow and dry meat and sing to herself in low French when she thought no one listened. Atsa kept his distance. Ruth saw it. Something in Josephine's presence rattled him, not fear but recognition. Like watching a wound he thought had closed open itself again. One night, when Josephine slept and the fire cracked low, Ruth asked, "You know her kind?" Atsa nodded barely. Once, long ago, there were women who followed the forts. Some by trade, some by need. She doesn't seem like a camp follower. "She's not," he said. "She's someone they tried to bury." By New Year, the storms thickened. They took turns keeping the fire. Ruth taught Josephine how to bind pine needles into mats, how to boil willow bark for fever. In the smallness of the tent, something unspoken formed between them, pain, shared and not named. Josephine began to sleep without waking in fright. Ruth began to dream again, once of her sister, standing in a field, arms bare and laughing. One evening, as snow fell like sifted flour outside, Josephine spoke. "They killed my husband." The fire dimmed. Atsa looked up. "They took him for a thief, said he sold to both sides. There weren't any sides anymore, but they needed someone to hang. I tried to stop them. They burned the house. Left me under the horse." She pulled her coat tighter. "I waited 3 days for the frost to take me, but it didn't." Atsa stirred the coals, voice rough. "They won't come here." Josephine didn't answer. But later, when Ruth handed her a blanket, she took it without protest, held it like a promise. It was the 4th week of snow when the prints came, wide, heavy, fresh. Atsa found them near the edge of their old camp, boot tracks. 2, maybe 3 men, circling, testing. He returned silent, eyes dark. "They're close." "Bounty men?" Ruth asked. He didn't answer, just began packing. That night they didn't light a fire. They ate cold meat and lay beneath furs with weapons close. Josephine held Ruth's hand under the covers. Neither woman spoke. Atsa kept watch. His shape was a shadow near the tent flap, still as a carved totem. Come morning, they would move. But for now they waited, 3 of them pressed into the breath of winter, hunted not by wolves but by the past clawing back with human hands. They moved before first light. No trail left behind, Atsa made certain of it. He scattered ash over their prints, brushed branches to wipe the snow crust clean, burned what scraps they couldn't carry. The forest swallowed the rest. By the time the sun broke through the trees, pale and cold, they were miles deeper into the interior, where the wind cut sharp through spruce and no path ran straight for long. Atsa led, Ruth watched his back with growing unease. He was thinner, more drawn. Each step seemed harder, not in body but in spirit. He carried the war club always now, even when they paused to drink. Josephine, slower with her injury, stumbled often, but never complained. She watched the trees like they meant to speak. They traveled for 3 days without rest, camping in hollows and beneath rock ledges. Snow fell and melted, fell again. The world turned quiet around them, the hush of prey animals gone to ground. Then came the smoke, thin, gray, coiling. Atsa's hand rose. They crouched behind a drift bank, hearts loud in the silence. Ahead, downwind, sat a rough camp. 3 men, 1 rifle at rest, another propped against a log, a mule tethered, a pot steaming. Ruth felt the cold settle deeper into her spine. Atsa's eyes moved over the camp, slow and heavy. Then he looked at Ruth. They followed us. He didn't say how he knew. He didn't need to. Josephine's breath came in short hitches. "What do we do?" she whispered. Atsa scanned the ridge, then nodded once. "We don't run anymore." The night fell fast. Ruth and Josephine stayed hidden beneath a root-cloaked overhang while Atsa moved alone into the dark. He'd taken nothing but the war club and a small hunting blade. No bow, no torch. His coat was drawn close, face painted with ash. He didn't say goodbye. Ruth wanted to stop him, to offer something, words, a promise, but he had already gone, a ripple in the shadows, silent as breath. Josephine gripped Ruth's hand. "He's going to kill them," she said, not with fear, with awe. Ruth shook her head. "No, he's going to make them leave." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure. They heard nothing for hours, only wind and the groan of tree limbs under snow. Then a cry, not pain, not rage. A cry sharp and full of panic, cut short, then silence again. He returned at dawn. Face streaked with ash, coat blood-marked but whole. His gaze found Ruth's first, not relief, not pride. Just exhaustion, like something sacred had been spent in him. "They're gone," he said. That was all. She didn't ask how. He slept that whole day, unmoving. Ruth watched over him while Josephine sat with a cloth and tried to scrub the dried blood from his sleeves. That evening, when the light turned blue and quiet across the pines, Ruth stepped out alone, stood with her hands tucked into her sides, watching the steam lift off a nearby stream. Snowmelt, renewal, but it didn't feel clean. Atsa joined her, said nothing. His presence was a thing she could feel more than see. "You didn't kill them," she said softly. "No. You could have." He didn't answer, but his silence spoke enough. "You ever think about going east?" she asked after a while. "Past the line, starting new." Atsa looked toward the rising land, where peaks stood sharp and silver. "There's no east for people like me. There's no west, either." She turned to him. There was something in her eyes now, hunger, yes, but not for food or safety, for place, for someone to say yes when the rest of the world had said no. He met her gaze, steady. "Then we stay." Not promise, not vow, just truth. The seasons would turn again. Snow would melt, rivers swell, trees bud, the world would green itself. But for now, 3 souls shared a fire in a tent stitched with old hands, guarded by silence and the memory of things survived. No one came for them again, and when Ruth lay down that night beside the fire's glow, she no longer dreamed of falling. She dreamed of hands in the earth, of roots. By spring, the land breathed again. Creeks ran swollen with meltwater flooding low trails. Fiddlehead ferns unfurled like green prayers, and the air filled with the warble of thrushes returning to nest. The frost lifted from the canvas of their tent in fine beads. Everything, it seemed, was reaching toward light. Ruth had begun to smile without knowing it. Her hands, calloused and thick with old labor, had turned deft in new ways, carving, stitching, smoking fish with willow bark, weaving lengths of dry grass into mats for trade. She laughed once, sudden and low, when Josephine dropped a pot into a snowdrift and swore in 3 languages. And the sound didn't feel borrowed. Atsa watched her more now, not possessively, never that. But with a quiet care, like a man keeping track of a star he'd long thought fallen. He still rarely touched her. Just a brush of shoulder when passing, a shared glance when the sky thickened with rain. But the space between them no longer held fear, only waiting. Josephine had built her own linta near the stream, covered in bark and dry moss, where she kept odd things, old coins, pine cones, a pair of cracked spectacles she never wore. She spoke more easily now, told stories that wandered, sometimes sad, sometimes bright. She sang while she worked. Sang songs Ruth didn't know, in words that bent like river paths and returned always to grief, then turned gently away. One evening, Ruth found her sitting in the dark, holding something folded. "What's that?" she asked. Josephine held it out, torn cloth, once blue, embroidered with a name. "His shirt," she said, "the one he died in." Ruth didn't speak. Josephine laid the cloth in the fire, watched it curl, watched it burn to ash. Time to be someone else. That spring brought more visitors, none with guns. A pair of traders passed through, crow-speaking, and Atsa greeted them with the reserved warmth of kin long absent. Ruth served them bitterroot tea. Josephine bartered rabbit skins for salt. The traders spoke of changes in the east, more settlers, more lines drawn on maps no one had asked for, the kind of talk that once would have made Atsa tense. Now he only nodded. "They'll come as far as they can," he said later after they'd gone. "But some places they'll tire of, too wild, too hard." "You think this is one of them?" Ruth asked. "No," he said, "but we are." They planted that year. Not much, just a plot of corn and squash carved into the loam near the stream. Josephine found seed from a wandering Lakota woman who'd lost her wagon but kept her pouch. Ruth took to the work like breath. Not because she wanted to tame the land, but because she wanted something to answer back. In the evenings, she and Atsa sat by the embers, their legs stretched out in silence. Once, he handed her the old bone pendant, the crow in flight. She held it in her palm, waited. "I want you to keep it," he said. She looked at him, searching. "You sure?" His face didn't change. "You kept me here." She wore it from then on, low around her neck, tucked beneath her shirt. One night, when the rain was soft and long, Atsa told her the rest. About the boy he failed to save, back during the war. A white soldier's child, half-starved and shaking behind a burned-out barn. Atsa had tried to lead him to safety, but they were seen. Only one arrow had been loosed, but it was enough. "I held him until morning," he said. "He kept asking if I was his father." Ruth listened, said nothing. Just placed her hand over his. He didn't pull away. Later, when they lay beneath the same hide blanket, no word passed between them, just warmth and breath, and the deep, slow hush of two hearts learning to beat in rhythm again. Years passed, no great event marked their staying, no ceremony, just a steadiness, a life. Other women came, lost ones, broken ones. Josephine found them first, on the road, in outposts traded like salt. She brought them back one by one. Not all stayed, but some did. Ruth taught them to plant. Atsa showed them how to track, how to read the land. No one asked who was in charge, no one needed to. They were not a tribe, not a homestead. Not a family, not exactly, but they belonged to each other. And when Ruth stood one evening by the stream, dusk folding gold across her shoulders, she looked out and saw the tent, the lean-tos, the smoke, and she knew. She had found her shelter, not in walls, not in law, but in the lives that refused to vanish, in the hands that held hers without claiming. She had been banished once. Now she was chosen.